I am here. Hello.
Hello. Yeah, that's great. It means that everybody is here. I think there is also a trainee in the room with me. Hold on, let me just.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, Saksham, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're right.
okay, yeah, great. Everybody's here. So we can start the debate. Yeah, so please type your speaker positions in the chat so it's easy for me to submit the ballot later. Also, if you have any POI preferences or gender pronoun preferences, you can specify them before you begin your speech. Yeah, so with that being said, I guess we can begin the round. Oh, okay, I guess the convener's not here. Yeah, I guess it's fine then. Hold on, let me just check if they're ready to stream or I need to wait for them or something.
Oh, we are totally ready to stream. Thank you.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Yeah, so we can start the debate. Calling upon Prime Minister to open the debate within 7 minutes. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep, you're audible.
All right, great. You're about to get the greatest camera angle of all time. Okay. I will take POIs over voice because I'm on my phone because my room is flooding. So I'm looking for like a nicer place, but I got caught in traffic. Um, so yeah, I guess for those of you that want to do it over chat, you'll just have to cope. I can't read the chat, so you'll have to like shout. Okay. Are we all good?
Yep.
Great. And if it's not too much of a burden, could somebody also just like say out loud time when it's 7?
Yeah, I'll let you know when it's 7 minutes.
Okay, that is, I promise, the last special request I'll make. Okay. Starting my speech in. Oh, okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. A norm with spiritual fluidity would honestly make such a better world. Like it's a little baffling how terrible the status quo is with a norm of spiritual rigidity, and the comparative would be a world where people are free to choose a religion that fits them, free to choose a religion that they love, and free to choose a religion that loves them. Setup. This debate is about this norm versus the status quo. The status quo is the norm we will call of spiritual rigidity, where there are some examples that people in the world live in religions where you are shunned and stigmatized for choosing to leave. Whether it be religions that say there is only one God and one true God, or religions that ban you from leaving and ban you from entering, making it matrilineal, for example, like some versions of Judaism. So examples exist for either side of the debate in the status quo, but a world on that we are defending on government bench would have far more of the examples of spiritual fluidity. What would this actually look like? Use your imagination. So there are many rigid rules in religion, but these rigid rules in status quo would cease to exist in our counterfactual. So, for example, you can't have norms that have punishments for you leaving the religion, or norms that say you can't have any other god, etc. You would substantially weaken, for example, the capacity of the Catholic Church to stamp out like heresy and blasphemy, like when they persecuted the Arianists and so on. So there are just many examples of how this would change, but generally the broad change is that it's easier to switch between religions, switch between different tenets of that religion, and mix and match these things. If anybody has any like serious challenges to that, you can like give me a clarification now. But if not, I'm just going to assume that this is debate, and it should be because it's probably the most realistic debate. Okay, argument 1. Rigidity is terrible. Most people are born into religions that don't fit them. This is for 3 structural reasons. The first is that due to many changes over time, it does not fit their personal needs. For example, there are religions that are harsh towards the poor because of how it turned out, like prosperity gospel, which says that if you're poor, it's because you didn't work hard enough or you're not virtuous enough, so God doesn't love you. There are some religions that are just by chance anti-gay, and the vast majority of people are born into the religions they currently have, which means most people will be born in a religion that has a deep mismatch for their personal identity. Secondly, many religions, for example, also have different tastes or different conceptions that affect people differently. For some, a conception of hell may be motivating. For others, it can be deeply terrifying. For some, karma can be, deeply gratifying in the sense that you feel like there's justice for you in the end. But for other people, they feel like karma is a totally useless phenomenon. It doesn't mean anything to anyone. Thirdly, in addition to this, there's also the point of community. Sometimes religions bar people from entering the community they truly want to be in. Like if you feel Jewish, for example, but you can't because your mother wasn't Jewish, or you want to marry into a Muslim family, but your Christian family won't let you marry. So the rigidity and the norms we have around religion prevent us living the happiest lives we have. What are the impacts of this? The first and most trivial impact is that this just traumatizes you. It prevents you from living the ideal life you would have wanted to live. It prevents you from living your truth. And it forces you to choose. Either you feel like you're going to hell and live that identity to yourself fully, or you suppress that part of yourself and constantly feel like you're not who you truly are. Secondly, though, is that many people make the leap and end up being substantially traumatized as well. Many people choose to come out as gay and stay in the Catholic Church and end up being substantially ostracized, getting outed by their family, getting massively discriminated. Thirdly and finally is that in many cases, this harm is simply arbitrary and just not worth it. And so maybe there are some cases where it would lead to happiness, but it's not an either or. You could still be happy in a religion that would make you happy if you could just choose that religion. So let's weigh up this argument. The purpose of religion is to find salvation and peace. We actually don't think it's to find a good moral framework, since that's the point of the law. And honestly, it will be impossible for anybody to epistemologically prove that one religion would lead to more goodness or happiness within 7-minute speeches. So instead, we just think that religions are more likely to lead you to salvation. People are in the best position to decide for themselves the religion that would make them happiest, not only because they are the ones that go and live through that life and know their personal preferences, but also because they're able to try it out for themselves. Opportunity because they're too scared to try and they don't have the opportunity to try. It concludes the first argument and shows we're already winning the debate. Secondly, though, in addition to this, religions develop better and progress better on our side. They develop worse on opposition bench. That is to say, we claim that opposition's norm of the status quo makes religions more and more radical, as we see in the status quo, where you have more and more churches donating more and more to right-wing institutions or being more rabidly anti-abortion. Why is it the case that religions in status quo with a norm of rigidity become substantially more radical? There are three structural reasons. The first is that they simply put an incentive to distinguish and compete with other religions, which doesn't make them more liberal, but instead increases their incentives to raise barriers to leaving, which means they become more radical. Is someone making a POI? Go on.
If now there is religious fluidity and people are threatening to leave the church, don't believe that it's probably people have more incentives to actually be more radical in the way they co-opt people now?
The gist I got from that POI is like how religions choose to change and convince people, to which we say religions don't feel the need to convince people to stay anymore because instead there's just a lot less conflict in the first place. Whereas on your side, some of these incentives to change will be good, but the vast majority of them will be bad because there's no way to guarantee it for sure. So instead you focus on keeping people and keeping them to stay as radical as possible. The second structural reason for time in the norm of rigidity is that they're simply put, most people that leave are the liberal or privileged ones that are nice, which means the ones that remain or the ones that stay behind are the most hardcore, the most conservative. And thirdly, and finally, is that the most radical ones are all
Did David get cut off for you guys?
substantially the ones that are going to get the most attention and the most and the most attraction, which means they're the ones that get the most people in them. So comparative would be is that religions on our side progress backgrounds. So is someone raising another POI?
Oh, sorry.
Did I disconnect, or is someone raising a POI?
Sorry, you cut off at one point in your speech.
Okay, what was I saying?
So the last thing I heard you said was the response to the POI, that you focus on keeping people in bad ways. And then I think you blinked off for like 10 seconds or so.
Okay, how much time do I have left anyway?
You were on 5 minutes and 40 seconds when you ended the response to the POI.
Okay, that's way more time than I thought I had. Okay, I'll continue from there. Okay. Continuing in 3, 2, 1. So essentially, what happens on opposition bench is that some of these incentives will be good, but the great majority of them will be worse and try to keep you there because the fact that there's no guarantee that you will stay. So instead, they will try and force you to stay rather than trying to convince you in an uncertain way to come onto their religion. On comparative, our religions progress much better when there is a norm of fluidity. That is to say, one, there's much more diversity because people can participate in that doctrinal discussion from different backgrounds, which means even if they're not part of that religion, they still have a legitimate say in determining the doctrine there. But secondly, is that people themselves interact with far more people, so the social contact they have with one another makes them much more likely to consider the opinions of others. Beyond that, the solace that you get from these religions is much better as well, which means there's less of a need for you to become insecure and become radical in the first place, because the fact that your belief is much stronger. There's a lot less internal turmoil because other religions are not trying to contest the validity of your religion, which is why if Op makes an argument about self-doubt, but majority of this self-doubt comes from the fact that you feel like you're wrong because you come into contact with other people that say you're wrong or other tenets of other religions that say you're wrong, which means not only do you have substantially more solace as a function of this third subpoint, you also just have religions that are much less radical, much less likely to discriminate others. What is the meta weighing for the entire speech as I end this speech? Number one is that clearly the objective of religions is to provide them with solace as it answers questions that no other framework of reality morality can. While philosophy and like law can provide ways for you to be a better person, none of them can answer what happens when you go to hell. Only our side does, but the problem is that when religions have the wrong answer, they make you feel deeply traumatized, alienated from yourself, and unhappy. What we provide you on Government Bench is the capacity to find a religion that is best for yourself. The fluidity of life is the fluidity of you to find your own meaning, and we give that to every person in this debate. I presume I'm at about 7 minutes now, so we propose.
Yeah, you were just at about 7 minutes and 15 seconds, so great timing. Yeah, thank you so much for that speech. Calling upon Leader of Opposition to open the OO case within 7 minutes. Here.
Right, just give me a sec. I'll just set my camera on. Hope David is okay with the whole thing in his house. So just give me 1 sec. Oh. Okay. All right. So I will like the POIs on the chat, please. All right. Okay, so I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. There will be 3 main pushes from opening opposition. Firstly, on how religious institutions will probably be lost and all the negative consequences of this. Secondly, why religious provides an exclusively important moral framework that's probably going to be lost as well. I'm going to prove to you why this is more exclusive and more dangerous than the main points explained by opening government. And lastly, why deterrence is even worse if they want to run a case on like religion being problematic for like conservative causes and that. Firstly, a bit of rebuttal to the main point on OG. The main point believes on the idea that in status quo, religions are so rigid that probably a lot of people felt out of them, and probably they don't have enough like dissent between one religion. This is not true, right? The reason for this is that like religions tend to be really, really huge and tend to diversify in a lot of different contexts. This means that there is a massive incentive for religions to adapt at least to a certain degree to what people's specific needs in a specific place needs. E.g., for example, Catholic Church has actually changed its way to recognize, for example, indigenous traditions in specific like Latin American countries without actually saying that other religions are valid. What they are doing is to include this part of these traditions into their main rituals, right? And secondly, there is bottom-up pressure from believers into their local churches. I don't know, like leaders, right? If a local leader is constantly pushed by people not actually getting into church in the first place because they don't rely on the full text and probably they ask for more questions that they can answer, they have the incentive to include more things. This is why, for example, all religions have adapted to this specific context. Thirdly, and more importantly, churches this big tend to work with sub-churches. You think, for example, in the Catholic Church, you have a really conservative side like the Opus Dei or whatever, but you also have like a really progressive side like the Jesuit people, right? Because one leader is not strong enough to hold all of them accountable. The same can apply, for example, with Islam, when you don't have one specific leader. This means that dogmatic challenges are not as huge as they have claimed, and people can still find a better part of or like a better side of their own religion without sacrificing the cohesive and importance of cohesion that we're going to explain, right? But lastly, on the point of how people tend to be more conservative, let's flip this argument, because in this world, in the dominant world, there will be a still minority of people who don't believe in religious fluidity, and these are likely to be the most conservative ones, right? Because they believe that the dogmatic principle is so important that they can't afford to be fluid in the first place. This means that religions and the ones in the elite inside government are the ones who are significantly more conservative. This actually will prove why probably first they have the incentives to be more aggressive in the way they recruit people, but secondly, why now counterbalances are not actually available. In the status quo, as progressive and conservatives are in the same church as having, for example, the Catholic Church, the incentive for discussion is much higher. And that's something that is empirically true. Look at how progressives have taken the church with Pope Francis, and conservatives need to discuss and agree on them on certain things. Now let's move on to our main arguments, right? Firstly, how religious institutions fail. Religious institutions will probably be in danger and will probably not be as good in a lot of scenarios for a lot of reasons. Firstly, because as commitment to one religion is not enforced, probably people see this opportunity cost to be really, really slowed down. This means a lot of things. Firstly, to be a religion means to spend a lot of time with the faith, means donating your money to a cause, means to support your church probably socially, and also to abide by the moral rules they are giving to you. People tend to be selfish and individualistic because they probably have the incentive, like for survival, biological skills, or whatever, to care more about their specific needs, and therefore to push back specific moral boundaries that they don't believe they are true. This means, for example, people being selfish and don't want to comply with like the church idea of helping the poor, things like that, right? But secondly, this means probably not spending much time with your community. What ties the community, like the religious community together, is the belief that we probably have a specific point of like feedback that all believers can give to one another. But secondly, the idea that this is the best way to get to the spiritual salvation in whatever form this is. This incentive is lost in the side of the house, and probably people tend to be much more individualistic in the way they pursue faith. This means a couple of things. Firstly, when you have religious institutions that are probably left out and have less power, this means, for example, less support for the causes that religions only push for, right? A lot of politicians, a lot of like secular actors don't push, for example, for support in terms of like peace agreements. Just for example, like charity work and support the most vulnerable, because they are not like really like really politically interesting or probably like really visually attractive causes to care about. But as religions tend to have a really moral high ground and probably have evangelical commitments. This means getting even to the pores of society, trying to transform people, trying to work by moral rules. This means a specific way of altruism that's probably lost significantly. Thousands of lives have been saved by how the church operates charity and support of people. This exclusive push and support for people is lost in the side of the house. Secondly, I believe there is a lack of cohesive morality, which is bad in two ways. Firstly, about the individual. Notice that you probably have a cognitive dissonance in the way you assess your religion, specifically in a time when you need it more, which is, for example, suffering, right? Why? Because firstly, you don't have a same sort of net support or community, right? Believers are not going to sacrifice their time or, for example, their resources to help you out because they don't feel that connected to you, because the idea of community or religious community has been lost. Secondly, you don't know which faith is better for you. If you have two faiths to choose and you have constantly been criticizing one and the other, and you don't have a really strong base fixed and embedded in your basic beliefs, you are less likely to believe in these things when things tend to be really, really terrible. The comparative is that in status quo, you get fixated on the Omesh religion and you have constantly pushes to support this belief. Therefore, if you have to face a crisis, you have a stronger response, and this means that probably you can have more emotional support and in general better tools to actually deal with this, right? So this means that on the individual level, the most vulnerable, both spiritually and materially, are worse inside government. We're going to run a third impact, but let's take a point from CG. Okay, no problem. Let's move on. So thirdly, notice of how moral cohesion is important for societies. Two main things first. First, notice that in a lot of like dangerous situations, for example, conflicts between parties, being religious and having a cohesive religion is most importantly for societies to work. Firstly, because this means that all people have standardized ways of seeing the world, and therefore this forces to get on agreements, right? Even if we have ethnic barriers, you probably have conflicts about like fighting one another, for example, for resources and things like that. If we're constantly pushed by our spiritual beliefs and probably fighting for something bigger than ourselves, we're have more incentives to actually care about, like, for example, I don't know, building peace agreements, or especially leaders who are seen as spiritual and objective are the ones who have more legitimacy to, for example, conduct these peace talks and to have support in a general term. Why is the comparative? The comparative is that now people can flip religions to justify terrible things, right? If I have a more flexible religion to justify something that is terrible, I can choose to do this and I can feel better with myself. In a lot of situations, the law cannot pursue what you're doing privately, but religion can. Therefore, there's exclusive benefit of how religion controls morally, both on the individual and both the social. For these impacts, we're very proud to.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Nextly, calling upon Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Okay, I'll take a POI between the 5th and 6th minute from the closing opposition. If I haven't taken at 5:55, 5:45, just raise a verbal POI. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 questions to crystallize the win from OG. Firstly, where do we remove the worst excesses of discrimination caused by religion? Because we'd say that in a motion that is about an entire world, you have to examine the entire history of religion and all of the death and destruction that religion has caused, which we can avert on government. But secondly, where are the structures of religion better for reform and improvement? Lastly, where is faith better, and the worst case in which if religion gets weaker, we're willing to take that trade-off. Firstly, where do we avoid most of the horrible effects of religion? Because as much as it can be a form of spiritual salvation, it has far too much of a cost and is far too arbitrarily horrible to many people that it's very hard for people to get self-actualization from it right now. David told you 3 things. Firstly, about rigidity and how trauma is so easy to happen. Just on net, right, in which people's personalities are very different and, it's not necessarily suited to whatever religion they're born into. The fact that you cannot change and choose religions makes it just that there's at least one part of religion that will offend you. Because of how arbitrary it is and how linked it is to the social norms at the time, because, most religions were made in status quo back when they were in a very conservative time, a very primitive time that was controlled completely by patriarchy. A lot of the essential tenets of religion are going to be anti-gender minority, anti-women, and basically anti-challenging or freedom of speech and expression. That is why David proved to you that removing dogma and hierarchy as much as possible is a necessary contingency to have is a necessary condition for you to have a stronger faith. As much as they say that, people supposedly like the rigidity in status quo, we don't understand why this is true. Why would you want religion to shame you and say that you're horrible and punish you for every single mistake that you made in a world where resources are limited and you eventually have to make a few mistakes at the end of the day? It's much better if you can pick and choose things that are most suited to your lifestyle, to your beliefs, and even your moral code. Because the morals at best on a side opposition are very flimsy, are very arbitrary and oppressive. But even if you don't believe in all of that, let's just look at all of the harms and vibe check all of their arguments. Firstly, they say that you can have bottom-up pressure from believers. How is this true when religion is based on dogma and hierarchy? When you think you're literally challenging the representatives of God when you call out your priest, and for the majority of history, for the Dark Ages, medieval ages, people who even dared to say something mildly against the church as scientists were burned at the stake or labeled heretics, right? People from competing religions, which they have not responded to at all, right? Never mind the religions that are super similar to you that you can choose. What about the ones that are directly opposed to you? The ones that are, some are for gender expression, some are anti-gender expression. Some are for freedom of speech, some are anti-freedom of speech. Just having that religion constantly calling you out, firstly, is more likely to have you die from something like the Crusades or the Inquisition or, colonization, which is enabled by religion when they call themselves the mandate of God. Or it causes greater cognitive dissonance in your brain, such that no matter how much you are loyal to your religion in the best case, you still feel like you might be wrong and you might go to hell because someone else's God is actually correct. When we remove that kind of thing, we remove this hierarchy and rather have this dynamism become the norm, right? It's much easier to choose and to not doubt yourself all those kinds of things. But even if you don't believe all of that, it's the social contract theory point from David that is much more debate winning, right? Because even if you believe that there's a way to hold people accountable, you are less likely to organically challenge these things because you are not allowed this information, right? They usually don't translate the original documents like the Bible into your language and they let a few people interpret it, right? And you don't even experience things outside your community, so you don't even know what kind of reforms should happen. It just happens by chance because of secular factors such as colonialism or capitalism, which happened far too late, and millions of people have already had horrible lives as a result of it. Because of social contract theory, firstly, you're more likely to actually change and realize the ability to self-actualize so much better, but you're more likely to be empathetic of other people, and you're not going to let anyone tell you that you should hate on other people or that their beliefs are horrible and that they're second-class citizens because of that. This eliminates a large amount of discrimination and, again, infighting over the course of history. Let's talk about the status quo, though. Firstly, no response to the point of David about how it's much easier. Okay, perhaps you can challenge the religion, but because it's so much easier to leave, a lot of liberal people, the people who want to change the system, would rather leave and go to things such as secular institutions and the law and basic human rights, basic decency, which is a lot more forgiving. And achievable for the average person, right? That is why even though it's possible for people to join other religions, they're more likely just going to be completely free. And so it doesn't matter that you say you can shift from Opus Dei to something similar, because firstly, the very conservative people that stay within Opus Dei will hate you for joining a Methodist religion because they still think it's blasphemous in some way, and a lot of sin is seen as absolute. And because of that, therefore, shifting from Sunni to Shia is just akin to becoming a devil worshipper at the end of the day, right? So yeah, even though there are a few progressive elements within the church, they're usually overpowered, and you'd rather just leave at the end of the day. I'll take a POI from CG. Opening.
Closing?
Yeah, okay, closing, sorry.
I think you're overclaiming your impacts here, right? Because if this was true, more fluid and less rigid religions like Hinduism would be less radical. I think a lot of these things happen because societies and general human nature means that people tend to like otherize other set of people.
I don't know, you don't really weigh that. Perhaps there is some level of gravitation to other people. But again, when you're told that God will be mad at you if you entertain these beliefs of other people, and that, religious leaders are able to tell you that they're the enemy, you're less likely to make that decision on your own. Even if you still have a chance to do it, we weigh that your incentives are more likely to be anti-social contact in your world. Where do we maximize the other benefits of religion? Now that we've told you that your faith is more in control and your self-actualization is better. They talk about charity as this Hail Mary to try to save the case. We tell you that charity is symmetric on both sides. We don't understand why they haven't really proven why we're completely losing religion. We tell you that, in fact, you have better charity on our side, charity that's more accessible to all people, because charity in status quo is usually denied people of opposite religions, or they're contingent on you converting, such as the medical missions of Iglesia Ni Cristo here in the Philippines, right? In our world, since everyone probably patronizes or experiences each religion in some way, then each religion will give the resources, or they'll even be able to pool the resources to solve a lot of a lot of crisis. So even if you have slightly less money because you have less dedicated people, you have people being willing to pool and use those resources much more efficiently. And you can probably still make more money because even though people are less dedicated, more people patronize your thing, even in a small way. Therefore, you get more rich at the end of the day. In the worst case where we have religion weakening, we say that this is still much better because we avoid all of the excess harms that religion can do to you. You may not think that you might be saved, but at least you know that you won't be damned, and you can still go to the more progressive elements and the more progressive moral codes that are based on global norms and democracy, right? But at the end of the day, we'd say that you're more likely to go to a more fulfilling religion and that you preserve all of the benefits and have none of the harms. Nothing can outweigh this, and so OG must.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Nextly calling upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Cool. Okay. This is a timeline. This is today, in which OG's impacts are not exclusive and are symmetrical. And this is 2,000 years ago, in which OG's impacts were also exclusive and symmetrical in this debate. I think they don't engage at all with Mao's framing on how today there's something very interesting, which is rigidity in dogma, but diversity in interpretation, which eventually leads to 1,000 different versions from each religion, which actually allow you to have your preferences actualized as OG wants you believe. It's a good thing. We do have religion in syncretism with most particularities of specific places in the world today, but we also have that same diversity in terms of the way we interpret religion today. We do have the Franciscan order in the Catholic Church, which is far more progressive. We do have Papa Francisco today, which is far more progressive than every other pope before. We do have that same modernization and more progressive interpretation in the Mormon Church with Russell M. Nelson. We have the exact same thing all over the world. So if this debate occurs today, which I believe is part of the debate, I do think that most of OG's impacts are simply not true. Firstly, because secularization means that the sanction for leaving one religion is not just that big. So being born into a religious family is not really a curse because you can leave that particular religion at any given time. But secondly, because you don't have to leave religion at all, since, as Mao explains, you create different versions of religion and that already exists. It's not exclusive of this motion. They say, yeah, but that take a lot of time and it took 2,000 years to get to that point. And even there, it's not as great as it is in government side. But the response there is quite simple. Because they will have you believe that 2,000 years ago, you can pick like the nice parts of Catholicism, you can pick like the nice parts of Christianity, but then you can just exclude the bad parts, which are anti-minority. No, it doesn't work like that, because you could still only choose within a framework, a moral framework, which would probably still be anti-minority regardless of religion, right? It is not clear to me why you would have other options available back in the time, which would be pro-minority. That doesn't exist 2,000 years ago. So that doesn't exist 3,000 years ago. In that particular instance, what would actually happen is something different, which is if you try to do that, you will still get pushback by your family. You will still get called that you're a devil, that you're sacrilegious, that you are totally insane, and so on and so forth. So those impacts on being pro-minority within religion are symmetric today and were symmetric 2,000 years ago. Closing.
So as you correctly identify, like it's if that's going to be the case, nothing really changes. We're debating this at present, assuming that people do have the option to pick and choose different types of sacraments and practices. So why not give people the option to do that if they don't agree with what's happening in their current religion?
Okay. Firstly, I think that's sneaky, but not true. I mean, that part is symmetric, but the other part isn't, which is all Mao's speech on the structural part of religion and how religion as an organization is much weaker on their side, because you necessarily need to meet a dogmatic high threshold in order to be willing to donate to religion and so on and so forth. So you cannot just like take advantage that we just made symmetric OG's individual impacts to ignore all the structural impacts that we have on the other clash. You need to also engage with that ones. But now responding to the POI more directly, which is the individual clash today, as we said, we already have many optionality today in our side of the house, but we have particular difficulties and particular harms that we create when we say that fluidity should be the norm. Those harms Mao explained. Firstly, you create cognitive dissonance, and that's quite important because insofar as you answer questions from different standpoints and from different religions, you can never generate a strong conviction in any of those. And the problem with that is that eventually the existential questions that you have that religion must answer cannot be fully answered if you're compromising with 3 or 4 different dogmas at the same time. It doesn't matter that you try to make them compatible. Conviction comes from rejecting other dogmas. Conviction comes from knowing that you have, or feeling that you have, a particular version of truth which is superior to other ones. And that's just simply facts, right? We operate on that level every day. We operate on the level that the decision we're making is right as opposed to wrong. That's why you need strong convictions, and that's why you lose inside government, which is pretty terrible when you create those type of many religions, right? But secondly, and I believe this is also important, religion just loses its prescriptive value, right? The normative prescriptive value that you get from religion, you lose on their side. It is easier to just justify leaving out the parts of religion that actually modulate and regulate your behavior, because it is far more comfortable to do that than to stick to the whole package of one religion, which we believe is a good thing, because religion, it's not always this oppressive thing that leaves you all the time in terrible conditions, feeling shitty about yourself. I know it is cool to say that in debating, but I also think it's a stigma, and that's not just how most religions work all the time. Religion can be quite beautiful at giving you order, giving you structure, organizing your life, and so on and so forth. And for that, you need to also compromise with a particular religion. And those extreme cases are the ones that we already respond at the top of our speech. Mao already did. DPM decided to not engage, but I'll give them a PY right now, opening.
I just want to gut check this. If you go from, like, say, Sunni to Shia, do you really think your parents will still be happy? Like, our whole point is that limited fluidity still leads to radicalization and only stops when there is full fluidity and also fuller fulfillment, which is why there is less radicalization.
Okay, let's say full fluidity is an option, which is on your side. The realistic question is, within that full fluidity, not just today, but since the beginning of times, would you be actually free to move from point A to point Z? We don't think so, right? Even if you're theoretically free, you're still likely to get judged outside of the religious norms if you choose something that is morally, but not necessarily religiously, too different from what your family believes. So that's why that freedom doesn't really exist on your side. Is probably just an illusion. But even if it does, we're willing to take that. We're willing to take some individuals being slightly more unhappy with the religions, assuming they are unhappy because of all the structural argument that Mauricio presents, that we already get a ridiculization response from DPM. I think that argument is actually the winning point in this debate, because that argument simply proves an impact that's far more large, that affects far more individuals, but also that affects individuals not only associated to religion, because newsflash, everybody that benefits from religious schools, from charity, from foods that religion prepare for the poor are not only religious people, but actually everybody. So having weaker structures of religion, having weaker Catholicism on their side actually fucks over not only the religious people, but everybody else. That should be enough to win the debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Nextly calling upon the Member of Government. Here.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yeah, you're audible.
Alright, so- This is the TikTok lights. All right. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna spin the weakening of religious structures and explain why that's actually a good thing. Second, I'm going to explain why interreligious relationships are much better in terms of how religions view one another. And then thirdly, I'll explain the counterfactual OG missed. Maybe religions stop preventing you from leaving like your own religion. But how do religions compete, and why does it become better on our side of the house? Firstly, the weakening of religious structures, I think, is actually not such a bad thing, because oftentimes religious leadership doesn't reflect the good. Saying there are progressives and conservatives within Christianity isn't a sufficient structural reason to explain where religions trend towards the good. And that's important, because if we explain that they fail to do so precisely because of a lack of religious spirituality, we win the debate. And that's important, because I think what opening government does is to say there are things in religion that are bad. Now we give you an opt-out mechanism. The reason this will take precedent over that claim is because if most religions, for the reasons OG provides to you, generally present regressive ideas, then you are provided a series of options that are all not very progressive, not very inclusive, etc. What we will explain is that the regressive nature of religions comes precisely from the expectation of devotion and staying true to your religion. And that's because of these structures of religion that encourage power dynamics that make you not want to question incredibly dogmatic ideas. Because the first thing to note is that the people most likely to be very devoted and committed to the different moral standards of religion that exist today are the ones that probably benefit from it, which is why they see value in it, which is why they can justify when they harm gay individuals, because they think that's the moral good, because they themselves do not represent these communities. On base of selection of who precisely gets to decide the religious leaders and what kinds of influence they might have, this is already a section in a group that is more likely to be abusive. But secondly, is that the ability to climb up the ladder precisely depends on things like your expertise, your ability to interpret religious doctrine, etc. The problem with that is that these are incredibly subjective things, that the objective metric by which people determine whether or not you climb up the ranks anyway ends up becoming your ability to understand things on the most basic and doctrinal level, rather than interpretation, which can become incredibly subjective. And therefore, you sticking to the fundamentals, which is precisely why fundamentalist leaders have very strong sway within religious institutions, is quite powerful. In fact, Pope Francis is an anomaly and has walked back on so many of his stances precisely because religious leaders within Italy have called him out and told him, you are too much. This is way too much. You have to walk back. You have to say that gay marriage is sin. Thirdly, you have much more control and power precisely because people are so devoted to this one religion, and they see you as a religious leader as someone who is of incredible moral standing because you've stuck to it. And not just that, you've restricted so many of your own personal freedoms to be part of this religion because of your vow to celibacy or whatever, that we might as well do the same in order for us to become moral people. There are three reasons this is bad in terms of like larger society, and then I'll explain why it's bad in terms of belief. The first thing is that it's so difficult to question abuse because if this is the main religion that you see as an incredibly important thing to you, it becomes difficult for people within that religion to say, we're doing something that is evil. And so things like having the sexual scandals within the church, things like the historical abuses they have committed are much harder to call out because that would entail you having to find a new community when you don't know if they're willing to accept you, when it's an incredibly large risk for you and for your family. But secondly, is that because people revere these religions to a significant degree, want to be very devoted, they become incredibly powerful. And I think what opening opposition says is actually not a great thing. The significant ability of a church to endorse a particular candidate within an election, despite the so-called separation of church and state, is a fundamental assault to democratic values, is a fundamental assault on people's ability to choose, and oftentimes is simply determined because of backroom deals and negotiations that are made by religious leaders and powerful politicians. But thirdly, so their main benefit here is charity, and charity weakening is a bad thing. Firstly, they also get a significant tax benefit, and so if we critique them more, if we also tax religions more, we could possibly use the same money for public funds anyway. But secondly, their charities are not always good. Oftentimes you're funding anti-abortion clinics, conversion therapy, barring people from being able to access contraceptives. That's not always a net good in their world. I'd bet on being able to tax them as a more likely net good. Secondly, is it's better in terms of belief because you just have personal interpretation of Catholicism that oppose things like homophobia within the church, it's more likely for you to feel that individualistic power, as opening opposition says, to be able to resist that and ensure you feel safe in your own identity. But secondly, is that religious leaders, because they ought to reflect the norms of larger society here, are more likely to be open to various ideas, whether from other religions or even secular ideas, in order to cater to them. Secondly, relationships between religions become better. And this is an important claim because even if you can choose different religions and exercise them any way you want, as OG says, if you are discriminated and barred from being able to do so, especially when religions are at significant conflict with one another, that is not a thing you can access. If you're part of a minority religion, if you're a victim of Islamophobia, and this is important because within our framework, number one, you gain much greater cultural understanding when you can do things like be part of the ceremonies of a religion that you did not previously understand. If you can attend weddings and ceremonies and want to be able to mingle with them, it's less likely you feel like these such other to you and you will discriminate them. But secondly, because religions are exclusive in their world, oftentimes the strategy of the religion is to say this other religion is a demon. We have to hate them. We have to fight them. I'll take the POI from OO.
So at the same time, you can actually push significantly conservative candidates. Religion is probably the only force who is like willing enough to fight power in terms of like supporting anti-slavery things or like, I don't know, peace historically. Right. So what would be better on your side?
So one, yes, you could. You don't really explain structurally why that happens. Secondly, my analysis on why they're more likely to be aggressive precisely rebuts that. So on our world, it is much more likely to have friendly relations between religions, which is important being able to access the benefit of choice to begin with, especially if those that belong to minority religions and whether or not they can access their identity as a prerequisite. Lastly, how do religions compete? Because when you don't have a captive market of people you already have and they can choose anything, you are forced to be able to provide positive incentives for them to join your religion. So if religions were still powerful, then it's more likely to do charity on our side of the house rather than just renovate churches on OO, because you need a reason for them to be able to come to you. But secondly, is you want to be more inclusive, because if you're going to compete on being able to gather different groups of people, it's more likely you have to accept different identities that come with that as well. Thirdly, is that every religion is an assertion on how the world ought be. I think the important thing here is that the way you can differentiate yourself and compete is reason. And all the more, reason is more likely to provide good reasons as to why people ought to believe in a religion, and it's more likely to cause like benefit to them personally. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you, Member of Government. Nextly calling upon me, Member of Opposition. Here.
Just give me one quick second. I'll take POS in the chat only. I'll take one around 5 from OG. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think in this motion, like the idea is not about like just religions like are not punishing your rigid rules are being changed as like opening government claims, right? I think it's more about normalization of society and changing religions or being part of multiple religions or being able to live through multiple religious identities throughout your life. It doesn't mean that religion don't punish you or rigid rules don't exist. I think they still need to prove that. They do have mechanisms on that on government bench where they come and talk about like competition and these incentives will take them down in a bit. But firstly, I want to just show that like opening government, closing government both overclaim their impact. In the sense, like when opening government comes out and says, oh, you don't get like abuse towards like queer people in say, note that a lot of these abuses are not religion. Religions are basically used as an excuse, right? Understand that like even in places like India, where you have Hindus who have queer people in history, historically in their literature, they still actively shun these people and use to oppress them because it's more because of their traditions, more because they see them as others. It's because something that they don't identify with and not because it's what their religion says, because in reality, a lot of people don't even know what their religion actually says about these multitude of things, right? So the idea is the reason you bar people from certain communities, from certain ideologies is not religion. It's fundamental racism, seeing people as outsiders, seeing people as someone who weren't part of your community when you were in these sort of places, right? Also note that like forcing like sort of still happens in the sense that like forcing into these specific narratives is what people and community around you do. Even if you have more fluid like sort of like religious identity, more fluid spiritual identity, there's still probably coercive pressures to do things these particular way in a certain set of fluid manner that other people in your communities do, right? It looks like how the info slide says, like you set these norms then set up where you do like marriage in one sort of thing, you study morality from some other, and there's still coercive pressures that exist to do these things in this particular fluid manner, which means you don't get that level of fluidity as you claim, even if you have fluid things, norms tend to set up, right? Finally, on just the idea of like them coming out and talking about competing, right? Like they come and talk about like why religions will compete. Like, let's just wash this out a little bit. Note that the people who are coming to religions anymore don't feel that level of attachment to religions as they did before. This then means that like when like people still need to feel salvation at the end of the day, so they'll still need to come throughout, like they might be fluid throughout their life, but at the end of the life still feel that there's one religion that they'll have to choose for moral principles to find path to salvation, right? So we'll choose to join one in that regard. But like, why do religions have incentive then to appeal to these group of people who don't even fully identify with their religion, who pick and choose aspects and tenets they come around and do those sort of things, right? So like what our extension here is going to be is more about like democratization of religion, why that doesn't happen, and why religions flow more inward and get more and more radical, which sort of flips like all of these impacts. But before I move on, some more responses to like on the idea washing out of like social contact theory and all of these are sort of arguments. So in the POI that asks opening government, I ask, like, if this was the case, if what you're saying is true, then like religions like Hinduism, for example, would grow less radical because they're more fluid, because they're more open to interpretation and so on, right? Like because they don't have like that orthodox notion as, for example, Christianity or Judaism. The reason that is not true, the reason that you see more like communal and religious violence happening in places like India right now is again because of the same set of reasons that I've illustrated, right? In the sense that people stay attached with these ideas and norms, not because of religions, but because of what they're taught, because of what they learn from other people, because of the otherization that exists, right? The reason people stayed in Catholic and Orthodox Church during Martin Luther's reformation of Christianity and development of Protestantism, even though it was normalized to move into religions at that point because Catholicism was dying and like it was hurting everyone, was because of this philosophy of otherization. So what do we bring to you from CO? We claim that like when people have attachment to religion they're invested in, they're incentivized to like compete and like improve that religion and sure, which means like you have more democratization by religions like grow like more and more less and less radical as time goes by. So on like if you look at like how religions have grown more radical, which is the OG push in this debate over time, note that that's more because of like the relative fluidity that has established. In the sense when religions used to be more dogmatic like 600 700 years ago, people were actually not as religiously radical as they are now. The fact is when like people start moving out of religions, who are the people who are moving out? It's the most progressive people who have issues with certain tenets of religion, right? They don't feel as attached to religion because of certain identities, right? So this then means that like they have no incentive to change the religion that you're part of, right? in that sense that the people who actually want religion to change, who want to serve, use the diversity to serve as a counterbalance to what religion has, like don't actually go around and bring about any of those changes existing on any side, right? Because they actually move out of the religion, or they don't feel as attached to the religion. Note that in the counterfactual, in status quo, you still have people who are relatively progressive, who still feel that like queer people should have rights, but they're able to like constantly like appeal to their church for why these things happen. This is the reason why like there are people who talk about like how religion and science should have like some level of equilibrium existing and so on, right? This is why you're able to push and make sure your religion doesn't grow too radical on this side of the house, right? So this then means that the people who end up staying in these religions are people who are dogmatic, who believe there's only one path to salvation, who believe in this notion of like religion, and these are the people who dictate what this religion is mostly about. I'll take a POI from Oji now.
You can still find salvation on Gov. It's just that you acknowledge each religion isn't perfect and you need to experience more of them and take different parts. Your side has no answer to discrimination. At least our side can switch religions when you are being discriminated or seek secular.
Sure, but that's also probabilistic claim, right? Like it depends on the ability of people to recognize that you can find solace in that. Like the idea is you can believe like this notion that you can move around religions is probably what like this motion claims, but it doesn't mean that like you as an individual will feel that. The idea is when you're 80 and you feel like, oh, now I'm probably going to die in 20 years and I need to do salvation, and one thing says something else and one thing says something else, that I'd still choose to believe the same exact thing that I was believing till now, right? So I don't think like the idea is that like most people will still believe like you have multiple paths of salvation. I think at the end of the day, all of these notions, all of these norms are defined by individual people and the communities you're surrounded by, who you view as others, who do you feel attached to. Those attachments will still exist and will just take another form in that regard, right? But also like what this means is like firstly, like these sort of like norm that they're claiming cannot exist in this form as an equilibrium, right? Like the idea is that the most dogmatic people are the ones running religions, means that like even if this norm existed, like if you stop the word now and you move in this direction, like religions will again move to more like dogmatic norms. And this also like sort of flips like the competition point for what religions have incentive to do. Because note that the people who are running the religions in this sort of like scenario in the counterfactual, on Gov's counterfactual, are people who are like the most dogmatic, because the most liberal people who wanted to critique religion and who people who wanted to change religion have moved out of the religion or don't have the attachment or the ability or the incentive to keep on working on to constantly change it and so on, right? This means like you just become less progressive. So people who are stuck in that religion, maybe because they're 80 and they feel the need to like at least like have salvation, are stuck within that religion that's extremely dogmatic. It means if for some reason your parents are dogmatic and you are like you are stuck in that regard, you constantly feel pressure, you're stuck as dogmatic, which means that even though you have a constant norm on the other side, it still doesn't manifest to many people. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, member of opposition. Nextly calling upon Gov. Here.
Hello. Chat, please. Snipe ka. 3, 2, 1, let's go. Religion shackles its own followers. Many people are stoned for marrying out of Islam. Many individuals feel unhappy because of the practices of Christianity. Opening government is correct in wanting an opt-out mechanism, but Mikko at extension allows the House to imagine a world wherein fluidity changes the very process of defining our own spirituality in the long term, as opposed to simply just relying on people saying there's an opt-out mechanism if you are not happy into the world that you were born in. We would suggest that this is preferable because a lot of people, while they are born into the religion, also attaches the religion to the communities. So giving people the option not just to opt out, but to mix and match and change their definition of their spirituality to still fit what they were initially given, but to also accommodate different forms of religion that they may resonate with a lot more, is significantly more important and impactful in this debate. What I'm first going to talk about is why opening opposition cannot win this debate. The first claim that comes from them is that religious institutions fail. First reasoning, they don't automatically die to the point that they cease to exist. In fact, for example, there are still a lot of people to still opt in, donate, etc. That's a result in revenues. And I would suggest in a world wherein you allow religious fluidity, that's where you allow vast majority of religions, regardless of how major or minor they are, to still exist to some extent, because you're allowing people to still opt in and donate. But the second thing is the more important part of this specific argument is on the deplatforming of figureheads. Mikko, in extension, explains that this is good. We put power back into the hands of people people precisely to reject this form of dogma or radicalism, for example, that at the end of the day allows people to accumulate so much power just because they're the head of a religion. The third is that this is what Mikko precisely covers in extension through positive recruitment. He specifically says that if we value reason over logic, which is the natural consequence of, religions trying to market their religion and their respective sacraments and practices through the lens of what it can specifically give you and enrich you as a person that follows a religion, as opposed to trying to isolate you from every other religion, which is what happens naturally in spiritual rigidity. We result in a couple of positive things. The first thing is that we stray away from the dogmatic language that often results in a lot of hate speech or conflict, for example, that we want to eradicate entirely on government. The second claim is that fluidity is weaponized in bad faith. The first thing you want to know is that this happens on their side. The first reason why it happens is because often you are deprived of exposure when you are not in a norm of spiritual fluidity. Status quo right now, it is not normal for you to be exposed to other religions. If I am born in Christianity, I will be put into a Christian school. My friends will be Christian. I will have probably like 5 Muslim friends, and that's it. But on our world, it is the norm for you to be exposed to Shinto, to Confucianism, and other religions because they recognize that people should have the right, or it should be normal for them to be able to ascertain which sacraments they want to buy into. The second reason why it happens on their side is because of copium. It is supersized by your family's pressure, for example, to allow you to accommodate every single practice, even if there are some practices that you per se do not resonate with. You're more likely to think that the bad things are the good things, and even if you know it's bad, you're unlikely to act on it because you do not know what alternatives there are, or you're not allowed to act on the existence of those alternatives. The second response to this claim is that on the world of fluidity, the first thing happens. You gain access to alternatives and becomes normal for you to opt out, or, for example, pick and choose and define what religion is for you based on what works and what doesn't. The second thing that becomes normal is even if you choose bad beliefs, society can hold you accountable because the norm argues that you can afford to be better. If you think that the XYZ practice is very homophobic and bad, the world can hold you accountable for opting into that because you do have the option to opt out of that thing and choose a completely different thing altogether. This looks like friends, family judging you. The freedom of religion can no longer be used as a defense for religion-based hate crimes. We already win on that impact. What does Mikko do on extension? First, he flips this benefit. He explains that with the world that opposition wants to support, you allow people to capture the political, economic, and moral standing of communities, often for the worst. Second, it enriches our relationship with religion, even if they're not necessarily what we were born into knowing. But third, when opening opposition argues in favor of cohesion, but mitigates the entire government case by saying that Catholics have Jesuits and Opus Dei, they still have an aversion to choice, but that version of choice is not maximized because you're only letting them work within the religion, but you're not allowing them to have access for sacraments for some arbitrary reason. The next thing we want to talk about is closing opposition. But before I proceed, opening.
This internal cohesion is what deters religion from being much conservative, because in your side of the house, even if they are smaller, they are widely more conservative because there's no pushback and no dialogue.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about like cohesion later and with regards to conservatism when I talk about closing opposition, since that's more or less a shared case on OO and CO. But what I first want to respond to is why cohesion is not an automatic benefit. The first thing you need to know is like in the context of cohesion, even if you are not cohesive with regards to, you can't reconcile the fact that you practice Shintoism and Christianity and Islam, for example, in a world wherein that is the norm, no one is going to be there to actively inflict harm, social or physical harm on you if you aren't able to explain your beliefs. They don't explain to you what the tangible harm of this is. So I think, Judge, you should buy more the harm that you per se do not resonate with your version of your religion's matrimony or your, religion's version, for example, of burials. And as a result, the very important aspects of your life are things that you completely feel immensely detached from, as opposed to this nebulous harm of you can't reconcile the fact that you pray to like Buddha or something, but you also pray to God. It's not clear to me. The next thing I want to talk about is closing opposition. Actually, before I go on, CO, do you have anything? Okay, cool. I just want to flag. I tried to ask him a question. Closing opposition's first and primary claim is that a lot of these bad practices come from racism and sexism. First of all, this is a mitigation at best. CO does not explain how rigidity changes this. As a matter of fact, we would suggest that it is precisely through rigidity that people continue to be racist and sexist, just because you say that a lot of these problems don't necessarily come from religion, but rather it's just racist and sexist using religion as a vessel. We don't necessarily necessarily disagree with that, but you don't provide solvency anyway, so that's not a benefit. Second of all, Mikko at extension, resolves this with a couple of structural reasons. The first thing he says is that you can hold leaders accountable precisely through giving back power into people, because now not at the beholden of the dogma of the religion. Now they can hold them accountable. They can opt out entirely, for example. And the way that they can do this in a way that is compelling is because they force them to rely on reason and logic as opposed to dogma in order to explain why their practices and beliefs are preferable. If you cannot be like married in Christianity, you get to opt out altogether. The third thing is that CJ, but not OG, beats CO, because we are able to explain that those that are left in those religions are the ones that are most nutty, the ones that are most conservative. What fluidity does is that we weaken the religion and exactly deprive power from those that are most conservative. So even if they stay within those religions, it's not like they can do anything to harm other people, because that's not the norm, because they don't have the means to be able to do so. For all these reasons and more, clear CG ballot.
Thank you, Gov Whip. Lastly, calling upon the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
All right, give me just 1 second. Okay, I'm gonna get POIs in the chat, please. Going to get started in 3, 2, 1. Few things in the speech. First, our extension and why it stands in the round, some responses to MG, some responses to CG, and then some weighing over opening. So first, something that we got from the Gov Whip was that religion shackles its followers. I think yes, but the counterfactual that Gov wants isn't exactly, the counterfactual that Gov has to deal with is not the one that they want to claim. We show you in our extension that fluidity causes a conservative push and produces just as many shackles, just as much dogma, just as much coercion, just in different ways. Gov needs to deal with this, they haven't. I want to emphasize first a part of Omesh's extension, right? Basically, that religion, however Gov wants to claim, is not the reason for all of this, all of this discrimination for existing in the first place, right? It's simply a vessel of the perverse incentives that always exist. Gov can't just wish these things away. Gov even concedes this in the previous speech. To respond to the point that CG then made on from these religions, right? Which means now that the only people who guide where these religions go are hardcore followers who want to enshrine these perverse incentives, which means that these religions now turn inward, and then these perverse incentives, these discriminational like values and things, get further enshrined into religions. This directly counteracts what Gov wants, because what they're actually doing is just driving these stakes and these shackles further into the systems that they're trying to fix, right? Let's talk about what the extension really was from CO. I think the main push that Omesh gave you was that religions now grow inward, right? They become more dogmatic and conservative in like fluidity norms, and they try to establish themselves as such. What happens then is you create echo chambers. Omesh clearly met to you why this is the case. The weighing on this is clear. This intrinsically interacts with Gov arguments because their norms actually hurt the ideas of inclusivity and hurt the vulnerable groups that they want to protect on their side far worse than they want to admit, right? This also interacts with CG because even if the norm changes as they claim, and some people get an opt-out mechanism, Omesh explained to you that other people are intrinsically now coerced into believing in certain levels of fluidity or coerced into certain areas because dogma still exists and people still have certain stereotypes and certain prejudices. They're just shifted around, right? I think there isn't much of a delta that Gov can explain here. It just means that certain ideas get more deeply enshrined within religion in a bad way, right? Let's talk about some of the points from MG on the CG case, right? So first, on the weakening of structures, right? They tell you that, religious leaders have bad influences and bad intentions, and therefore it's a good thing that these religious structures weaken, right? So note, I think these adherents are primarily motivated by self-interest, right? When their power wanes, what do? They double down upon the dogma, they double down upon the things that secure their self-interest, which is exactly what Omesh's extension was, right? These religions just get more and more grown inward. I also want to note, though, this is a direct knife of your opening, right? Because open government wants you to believe that these actual religions get better, get more progressive, get better things, but what CG wants to argue now is that these religions actually falter and their structures crumble. I think that these two things are in irresolvable tension, right? Furthermore, I think that continues on charity and good impacts. I'm unclear what to make of the Gov bench on this argument, right? The bench thrust in general is that churches do better things when fluidity is a norm, and yet the characterizations we get from CG is that the church is going to do things like conversion therapy, or the church is going to do things like, anti-abortion and stuff like that, right? I think that there's an inherent inherent like tension in their case between what they argue religions are going to become and how the religions are going to act, right? Let's move on then to OG. I think the OG thrust in general is that people get shunned and hurt by rigidity, right? The government world doesn't have this problem and also incentivizes religion to progress better. A few responses, right? Let's talk about the impact that people are forced into certain religions and behaviors, right? Realize, as Omesh told you, that this coercion is still a facet of the government case in different ways. It's now enforced fluidity by social, peer, or narrative pressure, which means there still exists a cultural coercive pressure to do things the same way that your family does or your community does. For example, why? I think because like, A, there's a weight of tradition, right? Like people before you have acted in a certain way. Maybe people before you have taken religion A, B, and C and acted in ways C, D, and E, right? And so that means that even though you're not forced into a single religion, you're still forced to identify with cultural principles and do things which you might not agree with, right? Secondly, in upbringing, it's just your family probably wants you to act in the ways that they want, which means they're going to force you to do certain things. And finally, on community values, which means that your community might just happen to subscribe to a hodgepodge of religions, which still excludes you because these exclusionary factors still exist in the world. You still have to deal with these coercions. Before I move on, point from OG.
So your competition case presumes that competition makes religions better, not more insecure and more draconian. Sometimes they will be nice, but the incentive to be nice always exists. Now other religions are a threat. Also, we agree, CG Shafts.
I think I got most of the POI. I think the point I was really just trying to make is specifically that a lot of the mechanisms that came out of OG about how like religions are actually going to become more progressive and get far better are probably like not necessarily true when you consider how individual religious leaders and individual religious organizations act when fluidity becomes an added norm, right? I think that a lot of the impacts go contrary to what CG would want to believe, right? More also, there exists perverse incentives. I already talked about this, that like there's always going to exist incentives to be discriminatory, to do things. I don't think you can solve those things as easily as waving your hand away and giving a model on it, right? A response then to religious development, I've already talked about this, but the extension is clearly an inherent flip here, right? Fluidity pushes away moderate people and just makes the hardcore religion more of an echo chamber. I think originally opposition has given I think that organically opposition has given you a good reason to believe that these religions are probably getting marginally better in status quo. I think Gov undoes all this work to the point that they enforce fluidity. Also, a comment on OG's case as a whole. I think there's a foundational tension in OG that declawed most of their arguments, because PM tells you that Gov's counterfactual is that all rigid or exclusive or dogmatic elements disappear. This is a key mechanism for most of his first points, right? Then DPM uses historical narratives of dogma as a foundational mech as to why you are stuck in certain things, right? I think that this is they then concede that these like historical narratives, things like, oh, this religion is the one true religion, oh, there is dogma, he concedes that these still exist in the Gov model. This means now there is a foundational tension between the impacts claimed on OG in their first and second arguments, because they rely upon contradicting narratives and contradicting models, which are then followed by CG. I think this in general hurts a lot of the points that they tried to claim, right? So moving on then to OO as to why we're distinct and way over them. So we more realistically now interact with the meaning of this cultural norm on CO, because we give you structural and like analysis on society and how these religions actually are going to change. We distinguish ourselves with our unique extension on how fluidity actually causes a radicalizing effect among the whole adherents of a religion. A lot of OO speech fights the battle about prescriptive influence and how we might lose it. I think they're right on that point, but I think it misses the clash. Gov Bench as a whole has already provided alternatives to these moral principles and prescriptions in the form of philosophy and other forms of ideation, which I think means that most of the OO case misses the clash. What they don't do, and what we uniquely fill in the gap here, which is why CO takes this debate, is because we explain to you how these religions are actually going to change, how these changes in the counterfactual that Gov has to deal with isn't as rosy as they'd like to think, and that they actually get huge outsized harms for the people they claim to protect. Because when you enforce fluidity, all you do is make religions far more oppressive. Thanks. That's what I propose.
Thank you, opposition whip. The debate is now over. This is a closed round, so you will not be hearing the results immediately. You'll have to wait until the break announcement tomorrow for that.